50 years ago, the European Union and China established diplomatic ties. A lot has changed in that half-century. Back in 1975, the EU numbered just 9 member states. It now boasts 27. China, too, has changed. Unprecedented growth has made it an economic powerhouse, and it's now flexing its political and military muscles on the world stage with a new sense of confidence. 50 years ago, the EU was the senior partner. Now, Brussels and Beijing are more like equal partners, although that depends on who you ask. Officials from the European Union and China gathered in Beijing to mark this 50-year milestone. European Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and Council President Costa led the EU delegation. In talks with Chinese President Xi Jinping, there was some agreement on how Brussels and Beijing can both act to tackle climate change. But that was about it. 50 years into their relationship, von der Leyen was keen to point out that some things have to change.
Europe keeps its market open to Chinese goods. This reflects our long-standing commitment to rules-based trade. However, this openness is not matched by China. The European Union's trade deficit with China has doubled in the last decade, reaching more than 300 billion euros by now. So we have reached a clear inflection point. As we said to the Chinese leadership, for trade to remain mutually beneficial, it must become more balanced.
EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen there. Let's take a look at what she's talking about. As she mentioned, the EU's trade deficit with China has more than doubled in the last 10 years. In 2014, Brussels reported a minus of 138 billion euros. Now its trade balance is 306 billion euros in the red. But that's less than the record high of 397 billion euros in 2022. The European Union is warning it will not be able to keep its markets open to Chinese goods unless Beijing addresses this imbalance. And there are other areas where the EU and China don't necessarily see eye to eye. There's China's support for Russia's military campaign in Ukraine, for example. Pleas from the EU for China to use its influence on Vladimir Putin to bring the war to an end have so far fallen on deaf ears. Electric vehicles are another point of friction. The EU has imposed hefty tariffs on EVs imported from China, arguing Chinese subsidies unfairly undercut European competitors. Rare earths are also a sticking point. China has introduced export limits on rare earths used in electric motors and sensors, prompting concern from some companies that they may have to stop production if they can't access the critical supplies. Joining me here in the studio is Andrew Small. He's a senior transatlantic fellow at the Asia program at the German Marshall Fund here in Berlin. And Andrew, welcome to DW. Let's start with the basics for a second. 50 years of EU-Sino relationships. Where do they stand today?
They stand now at a rather difficult spot. The EU used to call China a partner, competitor and rival a few years ago. This was the sort of triumvirate. Now they lean more and more towards calling China a systemic rival only. The relationship has rebalanced significantly after China's backing to the Russian invasion, and then the economic situation has rebalanced very dramatically. A decade ago, it was seen as a very complementary economic relationship, not least here in Germany. In the last couple of years in particular, the Chinese overcapacities, the surge in Chinese exports, and just the state of the Chinese economy has meant that we've been seeing more and more pressure on key industrial sectors in Europe. So it's become a rather tense relationship, as we saw at the summit today.
What's the bigger issue, though? Is it China's support for Russia or is it trade?
Well, I mean, China's support for Russia has translated into essentially the biggest enabling role that any outside actor has played for this war. If you look at the proportion of dual-use goods that Russia receives that are the vital part of their being able to actually wage the war campaign, the overwhelming majority of these are coming from China, and it's been stepping up some of this support, particularly with reference to some of the most important things it can provide on the drone side for Russia. And this, of course, goes beyond Ukraine. This is now a question of if we on the European side are looking at potential war scenarios with Russia in the next few years, we're also talking about China enabling the defense capabilities of Russia to threaten Europe as a whole and the wider European security order. So certainly I think that's the biggest overhanging issue that Europe needs to address in the next few years, not just when it's thinking about the bilateral relationship, but things like where do we need to de-risk from Chinese technologies and Chinese dependencies if Russia's biggest partner is China, and we're preparing supposedly with all of our arms build-up and other elements to be ready for conflict scenarios. But the trade impact is enormous as well, and particularly, of course, for a summit that has the EU and the Commission President there. That's the most important piece on the agenda that they were trying to resolve, because the so-called second China shock, this massive scaling up of Chinese capacities in sectors that were really supposed to be part of Europe's industrial future, Germany's industrial future, and now we're seeing diminishing sales in China, more export pressure to the European market and more pressure in third markets, and all of this at the same time as the difficult dynamics with the United States. So I think trying to address that has been the biggest priority in the last couple of years. But then on top of that, as well as those two issues, we've seen the cutoff of rare earth exports, and that has translated even more immediately into situations in which you have companies in Europe that have been potentially having to shut down their entire production because they don't have the requisite access to the critical raw materials that they need.
Yeah. You told me before the show that you were actually part of a delegation that prepared the previous EU-China summit. Let's look at these summits in general. What can they achieve from an insider's perspective, in a way?
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing is, these summits should typically be used for a few big deliverables. There should be a couple of things that the pressure of a meeting between the two top leaders can translate into something where the two sides navigate, negotiate, and come up with something that suits both sides' interests. And the real hope on the EU side in this case was that there could be a few of these areas. I think the sense earlier in the year was there may be a couple of ways of at least stabilizing the bilateral economic relationship. I don't think there was a hope of real progress on Chinese excess capacities or its push to dominate all of these industries. I don't think there was much hope they'd deal any differently in their relationship with Putin. But there could have been a couple of points where, when it came to, for instance, the Chinese are very sensitive about the tariffs that the EU has put in place on electric vehicles. They could have made some commitments that would have essentially replicated the effects of the tariffs. There could have been a framework put in place for how Chinese investments in Europe could actually translate into benefits for European competitiveness, European value chains, European technologies. Instead, I think this became completely derailed by, in particular, the rare earths issue and the approach that China took, which was Europe is in a weaker position now, and instead the European side has to be the one to make concessions. So this has turned back into the kind of summit that we saw, the last one that I was closely involved with preparing. This is an exercise in message delivery on the two sides about their concerns, about their views, and really very little beyond a joint climate statement that we saw today, almost nothing by way of deliverables.
Let's look at the trade issue a little closer. How large did the US-China trade dispute loom over this entire meeting?
Well, I mean, there's two dimensions to this. One is a bandwidth problem in Brussels right now. Everyone is completely overwhelmed with the US negotiations at the moment. So I'd say, relative to the last EU-China summit, this got less attention than it might have done. But actually, in terms of the scale of what's playing out, the impact of this second China shock on Europe is much greater than the tariffs that we're seeing from the United States or are likely to see from the United States. So in terms of the proportionate economic risks that are involved, China merits a lot more attention. I think the most important thing that played out, though, was the US-China negotiations on this, because I think when the tariffs were put in place at the beginning of April by the US, I think the sense was at that point, when China escalated and retaliated against the US moves, I think the sense was China's under pressure. It may be that Europe will, to some extent, benefit. I think this was the point in which they hoped they'd be able to cut some economic deals with the Chinese side. Instead, what China did was, by restricting its rare earth exports to the United States and forcing the US to back down in the talks that they had in Geneva in May, China instead realized that this is going to be easier than they thought. And they have a tool that they can redeploy against everyone else, including the Europeans, as they then did for the period that we've had leading up to the summit, choking off some of these vital supplies, restricting them, limiting them, and even when they do give them to companies, having this extraordinary array of demands for customer lists, industrial processes, essentially economic intelligence gathering. So I think the US-China dynamics certainly had a big effect, and the US-EU trade dynamics have had an effect in terms of how secure is the European position going into this. And I think the sense has been, without that deal, Europe is facing risks on both fronts at the moment.
Yeah, but it very much sounded like Ursula von der Leyen was there to play hardball. So what's the EU's leverage here?
Well, I mean, yes, in the end, despite the push from the Chinese side for the EU to concede on a number of things, they wanted them to lift the EV tariffs. They wanted to move. They wanted them to move on export controls. They don't like the sanctions that have been put in place on a couple of their banks for their dealings with Chinese firms providing materials to Russia. But the EU side did not back down on any of this, and I think the sense on the EU end has been this is a point in which Europe needs to hold firm against coercion. Some of the steps that have been taken on the trade side and on the security side are modest, proportionate, if anything, probably undershoot what's needed to protect some of, in particular, European industries. And so the idea that Europe would have to back off from this in response to the moves and pressures that China is putting in place would be too deadly a risk to the European economy. And they'd just play the same thing on repeat. They would come back in another few months and see what else they could extract. So the view has been Europe needs to hold firm, Europe needs to be ready to punch back if necessary, and there is leverage because Chinese economy, despite the headline numbers, is not in a fantastic position. Confidence internally is low. Most of the growth that's being generated in China at the moment is either coming from state-financed investment or from these enormous exports that we're seeing, this huge surplus that China has. And whilst the major economy that takes the highest proportion of these exports at the moment is Europe, just as the US is shutting down and just as the US is trying to shut down other markets to transshipment. So, in fact, it's a period of time in which the Chinese economy is more dependent on exports and more dependent on exports to Europe than it has been. And, of course, there are a few key technologies that Europe has as well, whether it's ASML and its exports of and continued support provided to China's semiconductor industry, but even in civilian aircraft and a couple of the other areas too. So, I mean, there are things that Europe can cut off, and Europe could go a lot further in shutting down the scale of access that China has to its market. It's been quite moderate so far, but if China were to squeeze much harder, there's a lot more steps that the EU could take. And China knows this.
That was Andrew Small of the German Marshall Fund. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I can now speak to Abigail Vasilier. She is the head of the Foreign Relations Program at the Mercator Institute for China Studies, a research institute here in Berlin. Great to have you on the show, Abigail. Now, the EU has been urging China to use its influence on Russia for almost 3 years now. Has anything changed?
I think China's position on the war in Ukraine per se has changed, and it seems that the actions from the European side to make China exert the influence that the president was calling for has basically failed. So we have increased pressure through including Chinese entities into our sanction lists. But when it comes to really changing China's support to Russia's war efforts through basically financial flows, through the export of dual-use components, here it seems that the EU has not found the real leverage to use to actually change what really matters.
Is there something in the toolbox that they could use to put more pressure on China?
Yes, of course. The toolbox can always be expanded. And I mean, the sky is the limit, right? We have now passed the 18th sanction package in which 2 Chinese banks were included. So actually, you can see that we are slowly moving towards secondary sanctions. And yet this does not work. And you were pointing at the fact that the security question that Europe has is also related to trade at this point. And we are increasingly making making linkages. And we are coming to a point where economic security is going to be a key topic for Europe, and finding some leverage that are from the economic toolbox to actually have an impact on security and our capacity to basically deal with China is probably what's coming next in EU-China relations. As it is now, despite the fact of having said for, I think since the war started, that China's support to Russia will impact EU-China relations, we have seen that it has not so much changed the trajectory.
Let's talk about trade now, because US President Donald Trump's tariffs have really upended transatlantic trade. Does that mean it'll now be easier for the EU and China to find common ground?
I don't think we are in this moment of the grand rapprochement, as a lot of people called it, saying if there are transatlantic tensions on the trade front, then of course Europe will turn to China. We are far away from that. At that point in time, we are facing a $305 billion deficit to the benefit of China. This is big. This has an impact, of course, on our long-term competitiveness and on the fact that Chinese overcapacity are flowing our markets, while at the same time our companies are facing barriers to enter the Chinese market. So basically, in other terms, China benefits from the openness of the European market when we do not manage to benefit from the size and the potential of the Chinese market. Hence, there is no such thing as rapprochement, because we have structural issues to solve with China to actually be able to move forward on the strategic partnership.
That's Abigail Vassilier from the China Foreign Relations Program at Merix here in Berlin. Thanks so much.